A tragic beginning in suburban New Jersey. The overcast sky matched the heavy weight in Sarah Williams' heart as she stood at the window of her family's rambling, century-old house in the quiet New Jersey suburbs. Fall had crept in, leaves blanketing the yard in deep amber and brittle gold, the air rich with the scent of rain and distant wood smoke. The world around her seemed unchanged, but inside the house, nothing would ever be the same again. Just a week prior, Sarah's adoptive mother, Martha, had passed away unexpectedly after a brief illness. The news had come as a shock. One day, Martha was bustling about the kitchen, preparing her famous apple pie, and the next, the silence in the hallways was deafening. Their home, once filled with laughter and the echo of shared stories, now felt cavernous and cold, every shadow a painful reminder of loss. Sarah moved through the days in a daze, her world upended. She and Martha had shared a special bond, one that felt both deeper and more fragile than blood ties. Raised as an only child for much of her life before Martha remarried, Sarah found herself often caught between worlds, never quite fitting in with the rest of the family Martha had built with her new husband, yet always fiercely loyal to the woman who'd chosen her. Now, without Martha's steady hand and warm guidance, Sarah felt unmoored. Relatives began arriving, the house quickly filling with the low murmur of voices and the scent of too many casserole dishes. Neighbors stopped by with condolences, but the weight of grief left Sarah isolated, watching the gatherings from a distance. She wore black at the funeral, her cheeks damp with tears, clutching a small locket Martha had left her. In the silent evenings, Sarah wandered the halls, trailing her fingers across the worn banisters and faded photographs that lined the walls. She recalled every moment, how Martha would sneak her hot cocoa on stormy nights, reassure her when she felt out of place, brush her hair with gentle strokes. Now, only memories remained to hold her together. But underneath the sorrow, a faint sense of unease began to grow. Small, strange moments, the quick glances exchanged between her step-siblings, the whispered arguments behind closed doors, the way paperwork was rapidly shuffled out of sight, hinted that Martha's passing might not be the only upheaval awaiting her. Hurt, confused, and more alone than ever, Sarah braced herself for a new and uncertain chapter, clinging desperately to the hope that somewhere, amid the pain, she might one day find her place in the world, the secret revealed. After the funeral, the old house seemed to pulse with silent questions. Boxes of Martha's keepsakes were stacked in front of Sarah's bedroom, left there by a distant aunt who insisted it might help her find closure. For days, Sarah ignored them, unable to face the task of sorting through the remnants of a life she no longer had the courage to touch. But on one stormy afternoon, as rain rattled the windows and the rest of the house slumbered under a gray sky, Sarah finally mustered the resolve to sift through the memories Martha had left behind. She worked quietly, fingers trembling as she unwrapped faded photo albums, stacks of birthday cards, and brittle old letters tied with string. It was in the bottom of an antique cedar chest, half hidden beneath a moth-eaten quilt, that Sarah's hand brushed against something solid. A locked metal box, cold and weighty. The key, a slender brass one, dangled from Martha's key ring, which Sarah had kept since the hospital. She hadn't thought much of it, but as the lock slid open with a soft click, a strange chill ran down her spine. Inside were documents she had never seen before. Legal papers yellowed at the edges, a birth certificate from Texas, letters in Martha's neat, looping handwriting, but addressed to an orphanage, not a family member. With a growing sense of disbelief, Sarah realized the truth. She wasn't Martha's biological daughter. She had been adopted as an infant from a children's home halfway across the country. A story never spoken aloud in her presence, hidden away for decades. Blindly, she turned over the pages, searching for answers she didn't know she needed. The adoption decree told her little about her birth parents, but it quieted 100 private doubts from her childhood. Whispers in her mind about why her hair was darker than anyone else's, why her eyes didn't quite match, why sometimes, in the company of relatives, she felt like a guest in her own life. Her hands shook. All those years spent longing to belong, to somehow earn her place, and the entire time she'd been living with a secret, even she hadn't known. Sarah slumped to the floor, document clutched to her chest, a storm of emotions breaking inside her. Grief turning into confusion, confusion morphing into anger. Why had Martha never told her? Did the others know? Was this the reason for the chilly stares and guarded conversations since the funeral? As dusk settled outside and the house darkened around her, Sarah understood that nothing about her life was as it seemed. The secrets in that small metal box marked the beginning of a deeper mystery,
Jack and Peter.
one that would force her to confront everything she thought she knew about family, belonging, and the past she never chose. Shunned by the family, the days following Martha's funeral morphed into a blur of awkward conversations, icy silences, and unwelcome discoveries. If Sarah had once felt like an outsider in her own home, that sensation now intensified 100-fold. The quiet tolerance her step-siblings had always shown her dissolved almost overnight, replaced by suspicion and thinly veiled resentment. It began with small, almost imperceptible changes. The siblings, 2 brothers, Peter and Jack, and 1 sister, Elaine, began disappearing behind closed doors for whispered conversations as soon as she entered the room. If she asked a question, their responses became curt or evasive. Sometimes, they acted as if she wasn't there at all, resuming their discussions with their backs to her. Sarah tried her best to stay out of their way, retreating to her room or the empty corners of the house, where she could grieve in private. But even in her solitude, she couldn't escape their disapproval. She would often hear her name spoken in low, urgent tones from behind thin walls, or catch the abrupt hush that fell over the kitchen when she walked in unexpectedly. On the rare occasions she did join them for a meal, the air was tense, full of unspoken accusations, enforced politeness. It didn't take long for the tension to escalate. One afternoon, while searching for a book in the study, Sarah opened the drawer where her mother kept important family documents. To her shock, the envelopes and folders were gone. She later found out that Jack had taken custody of all the paperwork for safekeeping. When Sarah asked about it, Jack just shrugged. "You wouldn't understand all the legal stuff," he said, barely looking at her over his phone. The message was clear. She was not to be trusted with any responsibility, not even the smallest remnants of her mother's life. Soon after, discussion turned to the will. Sarah overheard Peter, ever the pragmatist, complaining to Elaine about the costs of the funeral and how an adopted kid shouldn't get a share when there are real family members. The words struck Sarah with a force she hadn't anticipated. It was the first time anyone had said the word adopted out loud since her discovery, and it stung bitterly. As the days edged into weeks, her siblings' hostility became more overt. Peter started removing Sarah's belongings from the shared spaces, piling them outside her bedroom door without a word. Elaine, who had once confided in Sarah about her high school heartbreaks, no longer met her gaze or responded to her greetings. Even Jack, The oldest and once the most level-headed could barely conceal his annoyance when forced to interact with her. The true blow came one evening when a letter from Martha's estate lawyer arrived. The family gathered in the living room for its opening. The lawyer, speaking in measured tones, explained that Martha's will left the house and most of the assets equally to her children. But the document also contained a handwritten addendum listing a small trust and several personal items, some of sentimental value, bequeathed specifically to Sarah. The moment the lawyer read her name, all hell broke loose. Elaine almost immediately objected, raising her voice in disbelief. Mom barely knew her birth parents. Why should Sarah get anything more than what she's already had? Peter leaned forward, nostrils flaring, and demanded a review of the legalities. Jack muttered something under his breath about blood ties. The lawyer, keeping professional composure, assured them that Martha's wishes were clear, but promised to review any documentation regarding the adoption. After the meeting, the siblings huddled in the kitchen, heatedly debating strategies. Sarah, standing alone in the hallway, could hear snatches of their conversation. There must be a way around this, Peter insisted. Elaine sniffled. She never belonged here anyway. Their words, meant to be private, reached Sarah's ears like sharp knives. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the walls of the only home she had ever known closing in on her. Things only deteriorated from there. Elaine began keeping track of the food in the fridge, complaining anytime Sarah made herself a meal. Someone started misplacing Sarah's mail. Late notices and bills meant for her would turn up, crumpled under the couch cushions. One morning, Sarah awoke to find the lock on her door had been changed. When she confronted Jack, he responded coolly, "We need to maintain the integrity of Mom's things," as if her very presence was a threat to their inheritance. Meanwhile, Sarah's grief became an object of derision. She overheard Elaine telling a friend on the phone, "She's just pretending to be sad to get sympathy." Classic. Peter accused her openly of wanting to milk the situation. Anytime Sarah tried to defend herself or ask for clarification about the estate, she was accused of being greedy or manipulative. It was as if mourning her mother was a crime in itself. Isolation seeped into every aspect of Sarah's life. Neighbors who had once brought casseroles and kind words after Martha's passing grew distant, perhaps sensing the tension or swayed by subtle gossip. Jack warned Sarah not to air family business outside their home, making her feel even more imprisoned by their collective silence. Moments of comfort, like holding her mother's locket or reading old letters, became furtive rituals, always interrupted by a knock on her door or a pointed glare in the hallway. Even the house itself seemed to conspire against her. The familiar creaks and groans of the floorboards took on a sinister quality. Rooms she had once found cozy now felt hostile and cold. The laughter that once rang through the kitchen was replaced by bitter mutters and slamming doors. Sarah understood, with growing clarity and heartbreak, that her siblings would do anything to force her out, not just from the house, but from the family and the life she had known. All the comforts and memories she held dear were suddenly under threat by those she'd once called kin, their actions eroding the fragile sense of belonging she had fought to hold on to. Yet even as she became more isolated, a stubborn resolve began to take root. The injustice of her siblings' actions, their willingness to erase her presence and manipulate the truth, lit a small but growing fire inside her. She found herself paying closer attention to details in their conversations, noticing inconsistencies in their stories, in odd behaviors during estate discussions. Their efforts to erase her only intensified her determination not to disappear. Standing alone in the house her mother had once made warm and welcoming, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. She would uncover whatever secrets her family was hiding. She would not let their cruelty define her place in the world or Martha's memory. For the first time, Sarah realized she had nothing left to lose, and a new chapter of her life, built not on others' acceptance, but on her own strength, was beginning, even if nobody was ready to welcome her into it. Determined to seek justice, Sarah lay awake most nights, the old ceiling fan spinning shadows above her. With each tick of the clock, the oppressive sense of isolation pressed harder. Yet, beneath her pain, something resilient began to take shape. It started as a quiet defiance, a simple refusal to let her siblings dismantle the last traces of Martha's love. Gradually, it hardened into determination. Sarah realized that if she wanted answers and respect, she would have to fight for them herself. Her siblings' hostility was nearly absolute at this point, but that only fueled her resolve. She spent her days in silent observation, learning how the others moved and communicated, noting who controlled the family documents, who was privy to which secrets, and how conversations abruptly changed when she entered the room. Jack, who now claimed to be the keeper of the estate papers, was meticulously careful about locking the desk and hiding keys anew. Elaine and Peter exchanged cryptic texts at the kitchen table, glancing at Sarah over their coffee as if she were a trespasser. Sarah's moments of solitude became opportunities for quiet investigation. She started with her mother's study, an untidy space once filled with the scent of Martha's favorite lilac candles, now smothered by a thin film of dust and the ghosts of unfinished to-do lists. Digging through boxes labeled tax receipts or holiday cards, Sarah found a forgotten journal, its navy cover frayed at the corners. Inside, Martha had scribbled bits of daily life, mundane shopping lists, notes to self, but also observations about her children. Some passages hinted at tension and secrets that even Sarah, as close as she'd been to Martha, had never imagined. One late afternoon, Sarah uncovered a faded photograph tucked inside a cookbook. The picture, taken decades earlier, showed a young Martha alongside an unfamiliar older man in a sharp suit. Flipping the photo, Sarah read the inscription in her mother's handwriting: "For courage and protection when the past comes calling." The cryptic note struck a chord, raising more questions than it answered. Motivated, Sarah sifted through every closet, every creaking attic box, piecing together fragments of her family's hidden history. In old correspondence, she noticed references to a business deal gone wrong and terse mentions of an incident involving her late grandfather. An anonymous letter with no return address, yellowed and brittle, warned, "Some things are better left buried. Protect the ones you love." The mystery thickened. Unable to shake the feeling that the answers were right under her nose, Sarah ventured into the dark, cluttered basement. There, in a dented filing cabinet beneath a tarp, she discovered stacks of property deeds and bank transaction records, most with her grandfather's name, but several conspicuously amended years after his death. Even more puzzling, withdrawals and deposits routed through a shell company Sarah had never heard of. At first, this growing web of intrigue was overwhelming. Who could she trust outside her fractured household? The neighbors politely kept their distance. Old family friends had all but disappeared. The lawyer handling Martha's estate seemed professional, but Sarah sensed his loyalties were not with her. She took to researching late at night, learning about inheritance law, estate rights, and the intricacies of probate courts in New Jersey. Every new fact strengthened her ability to challenge her siblings and, more importantly, to protect herself. Armed with new knowledge, Sarah grew bolder. If Jack left the study unlocked, she would photograph documents with her phone before the sun rose. Emails were sent to the county records office, requesting copies of deeds, names, and dates. In the midst of her search, she discovered a trail of payments to a private investigator hired by her stepfather years ago. An investigation that curiously coincided with the time Martha had adopted Sarah. One bitter evening, after another tense dinner, Sarah listened just outside the kitchen as Jack and Peter argued in low, urgent voices about the risk of the Texas birth certificate and Grandpa's mistake costing us everything. Sarah's chest tightened. The phrase, "costing us everything," told her that whatever her grandfather had done, it not only haunted the past, it now threatened the entire family's present stability. In her mother's closet, Sarah stumbled upon a small safe tucked behind winter coats. The key, as she guessed, was on Martha's old keyring. Inside was a collection of sealed envelopes, each addressed to a different family member, and a USB drive. Here at last, Sarah found the missing puzzle pieces. Martha's letter to her spoke openly about the adoption, the lengths Martha had gone to ensure Sarah would have a real home, and warnings about the family secret. It was a secret that, if revealed, would change everything. Sarah spent the next evenings in her locked room, reading Martha's carefully detailed account, and finally, plugging in the USB drive. What she found made her jaw drop. Scanned legal settlements, correspondence between her grandfather and a local politician, and well-hidden evidence that the family's early wealth had come from a high-profile embezzlement case decades ago. Worse, it implicated not just her grandfather, but her step-siblings' parents, who had all kept the truth hidden, laundering the funds through different generations. Suddenly, every cold glance, every argument over the will, every attempt to erase Sarah from the family's legacy made tragic sense. Her siblings' desperation wasn't just about assets. It was about preventing a scandal that could ruin them all. Once the initial shock wore off, Sarah weighed her next steps with careful calculation. Exposing everything right away might leave her vulnerable, especially if the others tried to discredit her or destroy what evidence remained. Instead, she documented everything, storing digital copies in cloud drives and sending encrypted emails to herself as backup. Each new discovery was recorded with meticulous detail, names, dates, and financial trails that could stand up in court if needed. As the tension around the house came to a boil, locks changed again, whispered phone calls growing louder, mail going mysteriously missing, Sarah summoned the courage to contact a trusted family friend who'd once worked as a local reporter. She asked discreet but pointed questions, seeking advice about whistleblower protections and the safest way to present what she'd found. With each new conversation, Sarah learned how to turn her isolation into independence, transforming in the process from a grieving daughter into a fierce advocate for justice. In the quiet hours before dawn, Sarah looked out over the shadowed backyard, the last colors of autumn fading under a pale moon. She realized that her search for justice wasn't just about righting old wrongs or reclaiming stolen inheritance. It was about reclaiming her identity, her dignity, and the future that Martha had hoped she would build for herself. By the time Thanksgiving approached and Sarah's siblings gathered to carve up what they thought was rightfully theirs, Sarah was no longer the passive, grieving outsider they believed her to be. Armed with evidence, courage, and a deep sense of purpose, she was ready to confront them and the past in a bid for the truth that would finally set her free. A horrifying discovery. Sarah never would have imagined that the simple act of delving into dusty old documents could upend her understanding of her entire existence. In the days and nights that followed her mother's cryptic revelations, she became obsessed. Her insomnia stretched longer, her meals untouched, her mind churning through possibilities as she sifted through every piece of evidence she could secretly collect. She began to suspect that the family's fortune, reputation, and even their place in the community all rested on something much darker than hard work or luck. One bitterly cold evening, after everyone else had left for a late meeting with the estate lawyer, Sarah decided to return to the cluttered basement, a liminal space beneath the house that seemed to hold its breath, layered in cobwebs and the dust of forgotten years. It was here, in the back of a sagging metal file cabinet, that she found a battered leather briefcase, its contents tightly bound with twine and marked in faded ink. Private, R.H. Williams. Her hands shook as she carried the briefcase upstairs, locking her bedroom door behind her. Inside, she found stacks of yellowed financial ledgers, legal documents, and a thick manila envelope stuffed with decades-old correspondence. There was also a faded photograph, her grandfather standing with two men in expensive suits, all three grinning beneath a courthouse's marble pillars. On the back, penned in hurried block letters, was the note, "Deal finally sealed." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The deeper she dug, the more she realized how far the rot extended. Records of large deposits made to offshore accounts in the 1970s and 1980s were cross-referenced with property acquisitions across several states. There were names, aliases, Sarah presumed, carefully penciled in the margins, along with cryptic notations about risk control, favors owed, and elections guaranteed. Among the files, she uncovered a confession letter, never sent, addressed to her grandmother. The author, her grandfather William, wrote in fragmented sentences about borrowing from the organization he worked for, making promises to friends with influence, and arranging for damaging evidence to be destroyed. The final paragraphs described a night when someone had almost blown the entire scheme, hinting at bribery, blackmail, and the threat of violence. Sarah's stomach churned as she pieced the puzzle together. The family's wealth, the sprawling estate, the scholarships and endowments in their name. So much was being lauded as the product of civic generosity or business shrewdness, but it was all rooted in grand-scale embezzlement. Money siphoned from a New Jersey infrastructure project in the late 1970s, laundered through shell companies, and shielded by high-ranking officials who owed her grandfather for their political careers. She stared at the evidence, numb and nauseated, as its implications sank in. Her mother, Martha, Sarah now realized, spent much of her later life wrestling, not only with the need to shield Sarah, but also with the shame and fear of this family legacy coming to light. No wonder Martha had been so guarded, so insistent that Sarah develop independence and inner strength. In her letters, Martha described emotional exhaustion and regret. Why must goodness pay for old sins? And made reference to attempts to pay reparations through donations and pro bono work, though always indirectly. At the bottom of the case, Sarah discovered an audio cassette labeled, "For the Truth, Should It Ever Matter." She scrounged up an old tape player from her mother's craft closet and pressed play. Her grandfather's voice, gruff and slightly shaky with age, poured into the silent room. He spoke of betrayal and rationalization, how small thefts had grown into crimes too large to confess, how partners in crime had become powerful and untouchable, how threatening silence, secrecy, and coded loyalty had become part of the family's identity. He lamented the chain reaction, how legitimate business opportunities were poisoned by dirty money, how the family's name was bought with guilt, and how the innocent suffered as the guilty lived in luxury. The recording ended with a chilling line. If you're hearing this, then the debts I owe have come to collect, and I pray the next generation breaks free. Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes. The crimes her grandfather outlined weren't limited to a single theft, but a network of fraud, intimidation, and social manipulation that had burrowed into the core of the Williams legacy for 2 generations. Reeling, Sarah dug through more files. She found evidence that Jack and Peter, her stepbrothers, had recently used these old shell companies to move money out of the estate, first to avoid taxes, then perhaps to secure their own interests as the will was being disputed. There were emails, printouts with signatures, even wire transfer confirmations, dating up to just months before Martha's passing. Elaine, too, was involved. Her name was on letters to a real estate developer known for creative financing arrangements. Sarah sensed the depth of the conspiracy weighed heavily on everyone. It explained her siblings' panic, their moves to isolate her, destroy records, and keep her ignorant. Her status as an adopted daughter, technically outside the true bloodline, made her a threat. Were they protecting a fortune or protecting themselves from prosecution? Maybe both. But Sarah's horror was not just at the family's lawlessness. In the silent spaces between discoveries, guilt gnawed at her for what she'd called her home, for the generosity she'd attributed to the Williams legacy, for every time she'd looked down at someone else because of what her family owned. Yet now, the truth set her on fire. She was an heir only to illusion, handed a burden she'd never chosen. Her first impulse was panic. Should she run away, go to the police, give the records to a journalist? Still, she hesitated. It was her safety, her future, and her mother's memory on the line. She knew that a careless move could erase her chance for justice or reparation. Through sleepless nights, Sarah's mind wrestled with all the what-ifs. Quietly, she began documenting, digitizing, and backing up every scrap of evidence. She researched the statute of limitations for financial crimes. She found anonymous hotlines and whistleblower resources, and considered which authority might pursue a case this old. She rehearsed, in a whisper, how she might confront her step-siblings. Would she threaten to expose them, entreat their humanity, bargain for her share of the inheritance as a form of restitution? And beneath it all, Sarah confronted the question of identity. Was she doomed to carry the Williams shame, or could she be the one to finally end it? The horrifying discovery had stripped her of the last vestiges of her naivete, but it also revealed the raw possibility of starting anew. As someone honest, someone brave, she was no longer just an orphan or an unwelcome guest in her own home. She was the torchbearer for truth, and she would not let the secrets consume her. As dawn crept through her window, Sarah's terror gave way to fierce clarity. She would not run. She would not cover up the crimes of the past for the comfort of the present. What she discovered would turn her world upside down, and likely the entire family's as well. But for the first time, she felt a purpose all her own. Sarah closed the briefcase and stared into the pale morning light over New Jersey. A horrifying legacy had been laid bare, Now it was her move, the confrontation and the fight for honor. The days after Sarah's horrifying discovery passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. The house felt more claustrophobic than ever, each creaking floorboard and distant voice stoking her anxiety. Yet beneath the fear, a fierce determination simmered, a realization that the next move had to be hers, not as a victim or a passive witness, but as someone claiming her right to truth, justice, and dignity. In the quiet moments before dawn, Sarah rehearsed what she would say. She envisioned facing her siblings in the living room, where Martha's laughter once rang. Their eyes narrowed in skepticism and self-preservation. She replayed the evidence in her mind. The hidden ledgers, the cassette of their grandfather's confession, the records tracing illicit money through shell companies, and the paper trail implicating each sibling in concealment, if not active fraud. She also considered the cost. This was no longer just a dispute over inheritance or the bitterness of grief. It was a battle to preserve her mother's memory, to restore her own self-worth, and to break the chain of silence that had defined the Williams family for generations. The confrontation began not with a dramatic announcement, but with Sarah's quiet refusal to fade into the background. One morning, she joined her siblings at the kitchen table, a black binder clutched in her hands. The air was thick with resentment. Elaine studiously avoided Sarah's gaze, while Jack and Peter regarded her with cold suspicion. Sarah cleared her throat, her voice wavering only slightly. "We need to talk, all of us." Elaine rolled her eyes. Peter started to protest, but Sarah cut him off, opening the binder and laying out the first set of documents. Bank statements with unusual transfers, property deeds retroactively signed, interoffice, memos referencing damage control. With each sheet she placed down, the siblings' faces grew taut with alarm and confusion. Jack reached for the papers, but Sarah kept her hand firm on the binder. "There's more," she said, her confidence swelling as she continued. "I know about the offshore accounts. I know about the shell corporations in Granddad's name. And I know you've been using them since Mom got sick, to hide funds, to siphon money out of the estate, and to erase any trace of what you're all afraid would get discovered." A tense silence fell. Peter's lips pressed into a thin line. Elaine's mask of indifference shattered, her eyes darting nervously, searching for an ally. Jack, the eldest and the most practiced in the family's quiet manipulation, narrowed his eyes. "You don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, voice strained. Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled out the small audio cassette, its label simply reading, "For the truth, should it ever matter." She placed an old tape recorder at the center of the table and pressed play. The weary voice of their grandfather swallowed the room. Confessions of embezzlement, bribery, and the corrosive legacy of keeping such secrets. The siblings were rapt, their bluster draining away as the words rolled on. By the time the tape ended, it was clear the line had shifted. No more could anyone feign ignorance or downplay the gravity of what had been done. The cost of silence had grown too large, legally, morally, and emotionally. "I am not asking," Sarah continued, her voice unshackled, "to be shut out or for crumbs from the table. I am demanding that we honor Mom and ourselves by owning the truth. The world deserves to know the real source of everything we've inherited, and I deserve my place at this table, not because of blood, but because I am the only one brave enough to face what we are." She paused, letting the words hang in the charged air. "It's time to come clean, all of it." Jack shook his head, rubbing his temples. "And ruin the family, lose everything? Who do you think you are to make demands? I'm the one who isn't afraid anymore." Sarah replied. Her fingers trembled, but she stood her ground. And, if you try to bury this, I have copies of every document, electronic backups, emails scheduled to go out. If you take one step to threaten or discredit me, the authorities and the media will get everything. Peter's anger flared, but there was fear behind it. You'd do this? You'd destroy us all? No, you started destroying us before I even knew the truth. Sarah's voice was gentle, but steely. I'm offering you a choice. We go together to the authorities now, or I go alone. Either way, I'm not letting this fester anymore. A protracted, excruciating silence stretched out. Elaine wept softly, her hands clutched at her arms, as if to hold herself together. Jack's mask had slipped, revealing a haggard, frightened man behind years of hard control. Peter looked smaller, as if the weight of their collective guilt had deflated whatever pride remained. Negotiations followed, tense, tearful, and raw. Jack pleaded for time, hoping for a miracle or a technicality to shield them. Elaine apologized, voice trembling, confessing her complicity, but blaming the toxic cycles of their upbringing. Even Peter admitted his fear, and beneath the bravado, the aching vulnerability of someone who had worked so hard to keep the family's house of cards from collapsing. Sarah listened, but she did not waver. She laid out her terms, a full confession to the authorities, transparent cooperation with investigators, a public statement acknowledging Martha's efforts to redress the family's legacy, and, above all else, acknowledgement of Sarah's place among them, not as an afterthought or legal loophole, but as someone deserving of respect and agency. Reluctantly, the others agreed. There were phone calls, meetings with lawyers, and the slow, agonizing disclosure of information long buried. The process of disentangling the past was humiliating and exhausting. News began to spread, first through the whisper network of local society, then through official channels. There was talk of restitution, of charitable donations, and the hard work of facing the damage that had propped up the Williams name for so many years. No. Through it all, Sarah remained steadfast. She was threatened, cajoled, and even offered bribes to step aside. But she refused. Every time she faltered, she remembered Martha's letters and the promise she had made to herself on those lonely nights, to refuse to be erased, to refuse to let others define what family, legacy, or honor meant for her. As the dust settled and the legal process wound on, Sarah felt the final ties to her old life loosen. What she gained was not just her share of the inheritance or her name in a dusty family ledger, but the restoration of her dignity, the knowledge that she had faced the darkness with honesty. She had fought for Martha's memory, for her own rightful place in the story, and for a better future built on the bedrock of truth, not old shame. Standing on the porch one last time, Sarah breathed in the crisp New Jersey air and let the weight lift from her shoulders. The confrontation had cost her nearly everything: comfort, certainty, even connection. But it had won her something far greater: her own story, written in her voice, no longer bound by the secrets of the past, freedom and a new beginning. When the ink finally dried on the confessions, and the last of the press inquiries faded into whispers, Sarah found herself standing in the entryway of the old Williams house for the last time. The autumn sun spilled through the cracked window panes, throwing long lines of light across the hardwood floor. The house was quiet, almost reverent. The echoes of old pain and laughter lingered, but their hold on her heart had loosened. She carried nothing but a single suitcase, her mother's locket tucked close to her chest, and a folder of documents, records of truth, of pain, and of hope for the future. Stepping outside, Sarah paused on the porch and took a deep breath. The air was cool and filled with the sense of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. A familiar comfort, yet charged with an unfamiliar freedom. For the first time, the world did not feel like an extension of her grief or a prison of secrets. Instead, it offered her an open horizon, quietly demanding that she choose, at last, her own direction. Reclaiming identity. In the weeks that followed, Sarah's sense of relief mingled with bittersweet uncertainty. She spent her days staying in a small rented room, surrounded by unfamiliar walls, but unburdened by the history that had weighed on her for so long. The emotional aftermath was messy. Some days, she cried over old photographs and silly notes Martha had tucked into her lunch years before. Other days, she felt energized, her mind racing with plans and tentative dreams that she had never allowed herself to imagine. As she walked the quiet streets of her new neighborhood, she marveled at how ordinary things, a kind smile from a stranger, the taste of hot coffee, the sound of church bells in the distance, seemed more vivid, more real, without the constant dread of family conflict. Sarah devoted her first weeks, free from the Williams estate, to introspection and practical steps. She began assembling the building blocks of a new life, researching jobs, considering colleges she'd once dismissed, and exploring volunteer opportunities with charities focused on adoption, family trauma, or restorative justice. For the first time, these decisions were hers alone. Each small step, sending out resumes, joining a book club, or even learning to cook a new recipe, became a quiet act of self-definition, unclouded by the weight of old expectations. Repairing relationships, building trust. Though she had severed ties with her step-siblings for now, Sarah did not close herself off from others. She rekindled acquaintances with childhood friends, people who had gently distanced themselves during years of Williams' family drama. Reaching out was awkward at first, her voice trembling on the phone as she navigated small talk and subtle inquiries about her well-being. But with time, trust returned. Old friends met her for coffee, invited her to art exhibits, and asked her about her plans. Sarah was surprised by how much she had missed this uncomplicated companionship. The ability to laugh freely, share stories, and feel truly seen. Slowly, she opened up about her past, not the details of embezzlement or inheritance, but the broader truths of loss, betrayal, and resilience. She found that others, too, carried secret burdens, estrangement, disappointment, dreams set aside. Sarah realized that she was not alone in her struggle to forge meaning from hardship. In connecting with others, she discovered a wellspring of empathy, wisdom, and courage that deepened her resolve to move forward, pursuing purpose. As autumn gave way to winter, Sarah secured a job at a local nonprofit agency dedicated to supporting vulnerable families and advocating for ethical adoption practices. The work was demanding, but rewarding. Each day, she saw firsthand the power of kindness and the ripple effect of justice and transparency. She used her experience and the lessons Martha had imparted when comforting struggling young people or mentoring new social workers, learning the delicate balance between hope and reality. Sarah stayed in touch with the legal process surrounding her former family's restitution. She attended hearings when necessary, answering questions clearly and providing evidence as needed. But she did so as a witness rather than a victim, standing on her own terms. Each time she left the courthouse, she felt the last traces of shame and fear slip away. She wore her courage openly, understanding now that true honor was not found in protecting a name, but in defending the truth, revisiting the past with compassion. Sarah also made a private ritual of visiting Martha's grave, bringing fresh flowers and spending quiet, meditative time reflecting on the journey they'd shared. She read Martha's letters from time to time, finding new comfort and guidance in her words. Rather than feeling defined by loss, Sarah now celebrated the gifts her mother had given: kindness, strength, the willingness to love, fiercely and honestly. These visits reminded her to honor the past without being shackled by it. She also wrote letters of her own to the siblings she had left behind, offering forgiveness, if not reconciliation. To her late grandfather, pouring out rage, disappointment, and ultimately a fierce commitment to making things right. And to herself, promising to choose integrity when faced with difficulty and to nurture the freedom she had fought so hard to win. Embracing the future on her own terms, and by spring, Sarah felt settled, if not entirely healed. She took pleasure in simple routines: early morning runs along the river, evening meals cooked with new friends, afternoons spent exploring nearby bookstores, and finding poetry that resonated with her sense of hard-won hope. She enrolled in night classes, eager to pursue a degree in social work or law, professions where she could put her insights and empathy to use, helping others avoid the traps that had once ensnared her family. The world, once frightening and unfamiliar, now felt like a place worthy of her dreams. Sarah allowed herself to ponder the future, not in fearful half measures, but with cautious optimism. Perhaps there would be love, or the adventure of travel, or the joy of building a family of her own choosing. Perhaps she would write her story one day, offering hope to those caught in cycles of silence and shame. Whatever path she took, she knew she would do so freely, unwritten by anyone else. On the first warm day of May, Sarah woke early, sunlight streaming through clean, uncurtained windows in her tiny apartment. She dressed simply, breathed in the fresh morning air, and felt the weight of her past dissolve in the brightness of possibility. She was free, not because her problems had vanished, but because she had learned to face them and move forward, no longer defined by secrets, betrayal, or inherited guilt. The journey had cost her dearly: family, certainty, illusion, but it had given her something priceless in return: freedom, dignity, in the quiet, unbreakable knowledge that she was the author of her own life. And as she stepped outside, feeling the world open before her, Sarah understood at last that freedom was not the absence of hardship, but the courage to begin again.